I'm just going to have Ben briefly explain the presentation while I get the screen up. So that way it's just not a bunch of white noise or silence.
Sure, yeah, I guess I can just start off by kind of like reiterating a thank you and saying like that we appreciate that Kelly is having us here in this space to talk to everyone, and like thank you to you guys for showing up tonight and to any other EJT meetings and kind of like being a part of this work that we've been trying to do in this vein. And we're excited to be here to talk to you about what we've been working on for the past 6 months. So yeah.
That was perfect, Ben. Unfortunately, I don't actually have the option to screen share. So even though that was supposed to be an excellent transition, it would have worked had I been able to go directly into screen sharing.
Let me see.
It still says, yeah, the screen share option, the actual screen share option is not there. It's just OneDrive and other stuff. Oh, there we go. Ben got it.
I'm commandeering it.
That's fair enough.
Let's see. Yeah.
We can take away my hosting abilities and give those to Eric so that they both have easier time.
Too far. Here, hold on a second, guys. I apologize.
Spoilers.
Standard
There we go.
difficulties.
You present. Does this seem right?
Yes.
Okay. Cool.
All right, so just to reiterate what Ben had stated so beautifully while we were supposed to transition, this presentation is a brief introduction to the 6 months of work that was put in by multiple participants and collaborators that's called the Westside Community Energy Roadmap. It was an undertaking by Push Buffalo's Community Energy Working Group, of which Ben and I are a part, as well as several other members that are no longer working with us, as well as a collaborative effort between Push Buffalo and the UB School of Architecture and Planning Sustainability Capstone course.
Yeah, and we have a slide where we kind of have like highlighted everyone who has contributed to this, and we'll jump into that in a little bit too. But yeah, I guess maybe just to provide some context around what we're even talking about, let's just kind of start. My first question is like, what is a roadmap? And I guess I'll just pose the question to the group now, like looking at this image here on the left, like I say, like roadmap, what are some words, ideas, concepts you guys think of when I say like, if I were to ask you like what a roadmap is? Anyone can jump in, shoot it in the text box, shoot it in like out loud, up to you guys.
Direction, a tool, are all very good answers.
Yeah, so I think all of those are super apt words to use when talking about like the definition that we came up with. And effectively, Clark kind of hit it on the head. Like one of the words that I've been using to describe this document that we've been working on is a tool that can be used to like really gain a lot of insight into like where you're currently located and how to create a path for yourself to get to your destination. You want to take this one, Eric?
All right. Absolutely. So I'm going to pose this question as well to the group. What is a community energy roadmap? Now, when we think about what a community energy roadmap is, I want you to keep these other two questions in mind. Specifically, in what ways does a community energy roadmap differ from a regular roadmap? What ways do you think it differs? As well as in what ways do you think they are the same? So just like with the last slide, you can go ahead and provide your answers in the chat box. I know it's a little weird to consider a community energy. Okay, there we go. A community roadmap is made by the community. Yes. People driven. Absolutely. Anyone else? What's good for us? Okay, that's great. Those are all very good answers. So when I think of what differs between a community energy roadmap and a regular roadmap, the main thing that I think of is that an actual roadmap deals with physical locations and topography, whereas a community energy roadmap is so much more than that. We do have a location, as in the entirety of the west side. However, it's less about moving from that location into a different location and more of how we can take the west side and move it from where it currently stands in terms of how the residents relate to energy and how that relationship relates to back to housing, transportation, and workforce, and how we move the entire community forward towards an energy independent future where we have community owned, operated, maintained, affordable, renewable energy distribution. And so in what ways are they the same? It's still a mode, it's still a tool to be able to get us to transition from point A to point B. But again, the main difference is being that point A and point B are less physical locations and more ideals and current standards.
Perfect. All right, so now just to like keep on with the metaphor, we've kind of looked at these four main pieces of like being able to develop and use a roadmap as being like somewhat guiding principles and like forms for us to use as we have like moved forward through this work. And so basically like what we've come to the conclusion of is that like in order to make and use a roadmap, you need one, like a deep understanding of an area in order to actually like decide how you want to get from, or like how you could possibly get from point A to point B. And then like a chosen method of transportation for like a traditional roadmap would be a car or a bicycle, and like those kinds of options that are available to you would kind of like guide the decisions that you make, the paths that you choose. And under these circumstances, it would be more so like what are your priorities in getting from point A to point B? And we'll jump into that in a little bit, but like, are you like really driven by profit, or are you driven by creating a system that is more equitable and more sustainable for the future? And so like those are kind of like what I mean by like a chosen method of transportation in this context. And then a destination, you got to know like where you're going, and then like again that will kind of help you guide your choices and like how you're going to get there, and the time and the tools to create the roadmap. Like how are you going to like do the cartography of like building this guide out, and like doing the research necessary to like gather the first 3 points and like turn it into like a usable, informative document at the end. And so we'll go into each one of these following this here.
All right. So when it comes to a deep understanding of the area, what we wanted to convey is that this project was effectively puts us in the early phases of community energy research and planning, and puts all of these tools into the hands of the people. Because when it comes down to it, we believe that those closest to the issues have the knowledge and really the desire to bring about the solutions that would be needed for the community. In essence, those closest to the issue know what they need, and we should be listening more to them and less to outside sources that would, you know, maybe be driven by profit or some other ulterior motive.
We know what we need where we live.
Exactly. Thank you, Bob. And when it comes down to how we developed this deep understanding, this included canvassing and engaging the community and having volunteers to help us fulfill this canvassing. Let's see. So another reason why we believe Push and the West Side community members are the right people for this job is because National Fuel are shareholder-owned companies whose primary interest is to generate profits through hedge fund investments. So like Bob had said, we know what we want where we live, and we know how we're going to benefit from it, how we want to benefit from it.
And yeah, so now to jump into this slide, like our sort of like guiding principles as we've gone through each step of this research have been the just transition framework and the just transition principles, which were developed by a group called Movement Generation that are based in Oakland, California. And basically, these principles stand as like a framework that will help us move from like an extractive economy, which we are currently operating within, and like all of the like polluting and inequitable and like extractive and kind of like abusive ways that that current system operates, into a more regenerative economy that kind of like centers equity, regeneration, and like using renewable resources, and it centers like creating democracy and allowing people to control and own the assets that like operate the economy, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. But one of the most important things about like how this has guided our work is this at the bottom here, this values filter, which has kind of like allowed us to, again, like guide each one of our decisions in doing the research. So for like specifically as we try to like transition from an extractive energy economy to a more like regenerative energy economy, one, we're trying to shift control to communities. And in the context of an energy economy, that means like creating like community owned and operated like sustainable energy resources. And the same kind of goes for democratizing wealth in the workplace, in that by advocating for and developing these community energy resources, we will be able to give community members like job opportunities and control over their workplaces and the result of their work, versus having companies like National Grid and National Fuel be like entirely in control of everything from the sourcing to like the distribution to the pricing of energy in our homes. And the same, and again, like, so advancing ecological restoration means like creating like green energy and using green energy like locally in our community, and doing so in a way that can create jobs for people that have historically been like disenfranchised from job opportunities, and so on and so forth. Basically, all of this is just to say that we're trying to create a healthier, more equitable, more democratic energy, like set of energy solutions for the future of the West Side. And those principles have guided like the information we've been looking for, and like through this research, and how we've conducted the research. Yeah, which we can also get into in a little bit. So
I noticed that Dave had raised his hand. What was your question, Dave?
I can wait to the end if you wanted to. I mean, basically, it was really just like, I'm curious if you worked off a questionnaire, and if you actually went door to door, like, do you deal with community stakeholders, or like how, you know, what structure or format did you kind of approach this with?
Absolutely, that's a great question. We will be getting into that in more detail a little bit later, but suffice to say that we did our canvassing, our door-to-door canvassing, with something called the Residential Energy Consumption Survey. Like I said, we'll go into that a little bit more in a couple of slides ahead. But thank you for your question. All right, so just move forward. We have in front of us our destination. So again, what I mentioned before, that when it comes to a community energy roadmap, the main difference is that we're not dealing with physical locations in terms of like destination and where you're currently standing. We're dealing with more ideological ones. So our destination is a community-owned and operated energy distribution system that employs residents within the community to serve the community's energy needs, effectively transitioning control and power and money from the energy conglomerates that currently exist into municipal hands and effectively into the community hands. And what that looks like, for example, we've got some pictures, is the solar array on top of School 77, the community solar array, as well as community assets and resources like School 77 itself, which is going to be that picture on the bottom right-hand corner. That's going to be a picture of the groundbreaking ceremony for School 77. It's very important as well, because School 77 serves as an example of how we can recycle certain structures in the community rather than keeping up with this consumerist bulldoze and build new framework that we've got going on.
Yeah, and then finally, like I mentioned before, in order to do this work, you need like the resources in the form of time, and like the tools in the form of like community relationships and like access to information and so on and so forth, in order to like actually like make your informative guiding roadmap document. So for us, that sort of methodology has kind of looked like, one, creating sort of like a plan and just like coming up with the idea of doing this in the first place, which was guided by the passing of new climate policy, which we'll talk about in a little bit, last summer, the CLCPA, which was then followed by the hiring and training of community members and like people that have already been involved with PUSH. So Eric and I and a few other people were hired as technical support for this project, and were then trained in like the just transition framework and how to canvas in order to effectively do this project in a way that aligns with the organization's values and would allow us to like really interact with community members and other like really localized sources of information throughout the process. From there,
it was also very important. It was also very important for the hiring process that we hired folks at a livable wage, which again comes back to this kind of systems that we want to build in the West Side will not just be affordable, but will also provide a living wage for all of the workers involved. Sorry, Ben.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. That's super important. And again, is like kind of guided by those just transition principles, and that this is like, we believe that this is important work and that people should be able to do this as a job versus like having to take time out of their free time to be volunteers trying to figure out like these kind of complicated solutions to these like big real world problems. So yeah, that was super important in this whole process too, is being able to pay people livable wages. And something that I'm super grateful for as someone that worked on this project. But anyways, from there, we like outlined the West Side as the 14213, 14201 zip codes, and strategically canvassed at 1,000 doors in those zip codes using residential energy consumption surveys, where we went door to door and talked to people, a representative sample of homes on the West Side, about their energy consumption, their energy bills, their experiences with the companies, and so on and so forth, in order to just like collect data from our neighbors in the streets and like really get like an on the ground understanding of what energy looked like on the West Side of Buffalo. And then from there, we like continue to collect information from the internet and like other databases alongside the group of master students that worked alongside us at UB in sustainability professional skills capstone course. And we also did a series of phone interviews with local experts in transportation, sustainable energy, housing, and like various other related fields that would be able to like contextualize everything that we were learning about energy systems on the West Side of Buffalo, in order to like just give us that historical understanding of like how all of this came to be, so that we could effectively make decisions about how to move forward with new plans for the future. And then from there, we did some like visual content creation in the form of graphics and maps, again, partnering with the UB students. And then we took those and kind of like put all of our research together into writing that currently lives on a story map, which is kind of like a platform. It's like a dynamic, informative platform. It looks kind of like a web page that we will share the link with you, of course, but it's where the roadmap in its like current form is living. Kat, who's here in this group right now, did a ton of work helping us to build that, and it has maps and graphics and all of the data that we collected and all the information that we were able to gather about the history of energy and our ideas for the future of energy on the West Side of And now we're kind of in this like new phase of the project where we are taking everything that we learned and we're kind of reaching out into the community, in this case through the EJT, but later in this summer, it's going to be in the form of a series of workshops, and we're trying to like really interact with anyone else that's interested, more community members, and just talk to as many people as we can about energy so that we can come to conclusions as a community about how to move forward with energy planning, especially now that the CLCPA has been passed and that we'll be receiving funding from the state, and that we can make decisions for ourselves through this knowledge and through our collective people power. So yeah, just with all that being said, thanks guys for being here and doing this with us. On to the next one. And yeah,
Here's we get.
Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Okay, I'll do it. Sorry. And here's where we're actually going to take some time out to thank all parties involved. So we have, just regular push staff, which would include the community energy workers like Ben and myself, along with Angel, Noah, Rachel, and Laura, as well as Kat. Then we have the West Side residents who participated in the surveys. As you can imagine, knocking on doors in the middle of winter was a very arduous task, and not very many people necessarily wanted to be standing out in the cold filling out a energy survey. So we really appreciate those that did, as well as those folks who happened to share their energy bills with us. That was a great deal of information. We were very appreciative of that. We want to thank our communities and subject matter experts for taking time out of their days, especially during a pandemic, to sit on the phone with us and provide us with all this knowledge. We want to thank our energy survey volunteers. In the end of February, for 2 consecutive weekends, we had a number of volunteers help us finish out our canvassing. And we also want to take the opportunity to thank the University of Buffalo School of Architecture and Planning Sustainability Capstone course. They provided a lot of invaluable work in terms of data analysis and formulating several graphics and maps that are populated throughout the roadmap. So thank you all as well for attending and taking in all this information.
Yeah, and another quick shout out to those students, and to answer Taylor's question. When I say that we did like some strategic canvassing and we were using a representative sample of the community, one of the students helped us acquire, I guess not help us acquire because it's readily accessible, but like helped us like look at and analyze census data that showed us demographics, age of structure, type of structure, whether that be like residential, commercial. There might have been a few other things, but we basically like took all of those different variables and created a list of 1,000 like addresses on the west side of Buffalo that we would be able to canvass that were like statistically representative of the community as a whole, in order to get this like as accurate of a representation of energy on the west side as possible. Yeah, so one of the things that we thought was super important in being able to understand, where we are today in terms of the energy system and how to move forward, and like why we came to where we currently are, is to just like get a good understanding of how the West Side came to be as a community. And so, yeah, this space, obviously, like thousands of years ago, and up until the late 18th century, was the only people that lived here were indigenous populations. More specifically, and like in that like last century, just prior to the arrival of European settlers, there was a development of like a confederacy of tribes that occupied this region, that had come together in order to create like a peaceful coalition of tribes that could operate like harmoniously, not only with one another, but also with the land that they like really respected and just like viewed as a sacred source of life that sustained them and their people. And then along with the arrival of European settlers, like came like a really kind of hard transition for this region away from that harmonious relationship between the people that lived here and the land itself. So that picture right there is a picture of Joseph Ellicott, who was one of the first surveyors in the region and did a lot of like the initial kind of like marketing of Western New York to like deep pocket developers downstate that like started really bringing like big capital into the region. And then from there, the completion of the Erie Canal obviously totally transformed this space and brought like a large amount of Irish and Italian immigrants into the West Side community. That was the first like large influx of residents into the space that we now consider the West Side, and like that was when a lot of the initial like residential infrastructure was built out. So a lot of homes kind of like came from that first wave, and then like continued to be built in like the following like half century, century after that, and then like eventually that became like a predominantly Italian community, and the next major influx of community members came in the form of Puerto Rican migrant workers who were initially working in agricultural roles like outside of the city of Buffalo, and then found the opportunities to acquire more industrial roles and began to move into the West Side in the mid 20th century, like 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s. The West Side saw like a large influx of Puerto Rican migrants. So that's all to say that like we now have like a large like Italian and Puerto Rican population on the West Side. And then more recently in the 1990s, we have seen a large influx of refugees that have come from like all different parts of the globe, especially Southeast Asia. And that has largely been driven by the fact that a lot of Catholic churches were in the area, like due to the presence of the Italian community and the Puerto Rican community. And like for that reason, those churches kind of like operated as resettlement agencies that saw the West Side as like a perfect place to resettle people. One, because like it was a really affordable community. And so, yeah, we've seen like a lot of people from Southeast Asia, like fleeing like religious persecution and climate crises in different forms, and from all other countries as well. And that has kind of created this like super diverse, like cultural melting pot on the West Side, and has brought like all of the like fantastic benefits that you get from having like different people with different views from all over the globe, like coming together and like operating as one community. Like people are speaking like Spanish and like Southeast Asian, like all these different languages from all around the world, like at the same time. And it's just like this, it has created this like really special place that we now know as the West Side. And then even more recently than that, like kind of for some of the same reasons that this was such an attractive community for refugees to arrive, because it was so affordable, we have also seen like a new wave of like real estate speculation and investment in the form of like luxury condos. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that we've seen this new wave of gentrification that has sort of like taken place on the West Side of Buffalo. And I don't like include this image of like yoga and like a nice coffee drink to say that like those things are bad. I guess I'm more so saying that oftentimes those things kind of like stand as indicators of capital being flooded into a community that has like historically not had as much access to money. And so when like yoga studios and coffee shops and luxury apartments appear in a community and aren't really prioritizing and understanding like the historical needs of that space, it can create problems and tension and all of these other issues that will ultimately like displace people and so on, which we all go into like much greater detail in the roadmap, just so you guys know.
To add to that,
I'm sorry, I just wanted to make a comment. The
No.
presumptuousness of
Go ahead.
the presumptuousness of the affluent is degrading the actual culture, is what happens with the gentrification.
Absolutely. I was just going to say that this wave of capital investment and real estate speculation is actually an example of outside forces coming in and deciding what the community needs rather than listening to the voices of the community. Because the community definitely needs housing, but in terms of luxury apartments that are well beyond the affordability of many of the residents, it's obviously a disconnect there. So there's a big difference between building a community up and gentrifying a community, and it really just amounts down to whose voices are being centered and what needs are being met. All right, so I'm going to start this housing slide off. Is anyone familiar with the map on screen? And if you are, please go ahead and let us know what it represents and any information that you might have about it as well. Yes, indeed, Angel. Hell, it's your time to shine. All right. So I'll just go ahead and move forward. This is what we're looking at is an example of redlining that took place all across the United States following the development of the Federal Housing Administration. So basically, what redlining is, in short, it was a way to systematically segregate and discriminate against certain sectors of society. What we have here are 4 different colors. These neighborhoods were color-coded based on desirability and ability to insure mortgages and to issue mortgages. So we have green zones. Those are indicated as best. Blue was indicated as definitely declining. Yellow, blue was indicated as still desirable. My apologies. Yellow was indicated as definitely declining, and red was indicated as hazardous. What's important to note is that a large portion of the communities in the yellow color-coded areas were immigrant populations, and the red color-coded areas were almost exclusively occupied by Black residents. These folks were systematically denied access to mortgages that were insured by mortgages that were insured by the Federal Housing Administration, and thus they were left into areas which would see several series of policies and just divestment in their communities. Let's go ahead and click the slide, please. All right, and so what we have here, we've got the redline map in the corner because that serves as a historical framework for us to sit in, and as well when we start to look at this work. With the tenure within the study area pie graph, you can see here that this indicates that 68% of the residents that occupy the west side are renters. This is important because it means that they do not have control over their living spaces. This also applies in terms of something called a split incentive, wherein most renters are not only responsible for rent, but they're also responsible for paying their own utility bills. Now, this is important because when we look at the bar underneath it, we find that a majority of the housing stock was built between 1900. Oh, I apologize. My audio is breaking up. Let me just try to I'll repeat what I just said, but very quickly. So we have the pie graph up top that shows that 68% of the west side is renter occupied as opposed to owner occupied. When the bar graph underneath this shows that a vast majority of the housing stock was built between 1900 and 1924. Now, how these two graphs play together and have a link is you have 68% of the population of the West Side is unable to determine their own energy future, to adjustments to their homes and things like that. And when it comes to the age of the homes, we find that these homes were built before an energy code was established in Buffalo, meaning that now a lot of these homes are incredibly energy inefficient. I would like to share just a personal story. I actually live in one of these West Side homes. I live on Massachusetts Avenue. My mother and her husband purchased in 2006. We've owned it since then. I believe it was vacant prior to that. We came into this home, and aside from it needing a lot of tender love and care, the energy systems in play within the house were incredibly outdated and inefficient, to the point of we were paying about $3,000 per winter for the first couple of years just to heat the home and to make it bearable. And this is not just as a singular story of mine. This is, unfortunately, a story representative of many folks in the West Side due to, like I was mentioned before, split incentives. Since the tenants are responsible for paying the energy bills, it's not necessarily in the owner's best interest to retrofit the house or to update it. So we then have folks who are stuck in a position of, we live here in the West Side and we're kind of stuck with these exorbitant energy bills. Up top above the redlining map is a graph that indicates that a vast majority of the property type in the West Side is either multifamily or mixed use. And if you go ahead and click the slide, then we'll start breaking down, the Buffalo Double. Now, so here we have one of the best options for increasing energy efficiency in the West Side is weatherization. It's a process that basically installs insulation in the homes, as well as tightens up any areas where, for example, heating might leak out. But before weatherization takes place, we have to address other issues that these homes might have, such as lead, mold, or asbestos, because without addressing those first, weatherization may exacerbate some of these issues. Next slide, click again. Thank you. And so this next slide talks about energy. Let's see, where did I have that here? Excuse me. We can use a home energy audit to determine where energy is being used inefficiently, as well as to point out obsolete systems within the home that may be especially hazardous, such as knob and tube wiring. Click again, please.
Yep.
Now, when it comes to diminishing our collective greenhouse gas emissions, it is a concerted effort. There are ways that we can participate on a small scale, such as cultivating our own food, being mindful of our waste and recycling practices, and utilizing alternative means of transportation. Click again, please.
Okay.
And lastly, a lot of Buffalo homes, those are made primarily of wood. This plays particular importance when we talked about like knob and tube wiring, because knob and tube wiring at this point is obsolete and a potential fire hazard. And since a lot of houses in the West Side are so close together, as we've seen in the years past, one out of control fire can render several families homeless in an instant. Click again, please. And so all of these four graphics are part of a much larger graphic, as we can see here, that demonstrates the typical structure in the West Side known as the Buffalo Double. And we can go to the next slide.
Yeah.
All right. So another area that we researched was labor and workforce. I also have a particular a personal story with this. Employment opportunities in the West Side are scarce, and this results in a lot of the residents, myself included at a time, venturing outside of the community for employment. I have worked in the past at, I'm sorry about that. My dog is rather rambunctious and young.
It's okay.
Anyways.
We can still
Like the Justice Team, dogs are always welcome.
Yes. So I used to work at, I used to commute over to Tonawanda to work at the 3M sponge factory, the sponge manufacturing factory. That was not a particularly long commute, especially because I am privileged enough to have my own personal vehicle. However, much earlier this year, I had employment before working with Push at a manufacturing company called Steuben Foods Incorporated. It's located out in Elma. So that commute was at least 40 minutes, and that's both ways. It's very important to note that had I still been working at 3M, I could get to that job using public transportation rather easily. However, to get to Elma using public transportation is impossible. I would have had to either ride share to work upwards of 4 to 5 times a week, which would be expensive, or I'd have to eventually incur some type of debt to purchase my own personal automobile. This is very indicative of a lot of folks in the West Side. When it comes to public transportation, the West Side, through public transportation, has access to about 13 of the 17 employment centers that have been identified throughout all of Erie County, as per Partnership for Public Goods employment and excuse me, I forget the name of the report, but PBG published a report in 2017 where I obtained some of this information. So according to that information, there's 17 total employment centers, and the West Side through public transportation has access to 13 of them. And that isn't necessarily the whole picture, because we then have to talk about the varying levels of frequency that buses come along some of these routes. But moving forward, so employment opportunities are predominantly in the West Side are predominantly retail and service level. This means that they don't provide a livable wage, they don't provide benefits, and that means that folks in the West Side have to seek gainful employment elsewhere. There are certain, for example, in the pictures that we have here, to the left we have a youth build collaboration with Push Buffalo after they purchased the home to the property 236 Normal. This type of workforce development is great because it employs members of the community and gives them a skill set that allows them to find gainful employment elsewhere more readily. However, some of these workforce development programs are a little sparse, and long-term employment opportunities are not at the level that we would like to see them at. And in regards to that as well, there are other training centers located throughout Erie County. However, access is still an issue, as well as eligibility requirements that sometimes provide barriers to certain folks within the community. So to remedy this, we have the picture on the right-hand side from local station WKBW. Says Push Buffalo to make sustainable training center. So this is going to be called the Sustainable Workforce Training Center. It's built with the promise of developing workforce training centered around green jobs, and the building itself will serve as an educational model and tool, as well as a shining example of how we can build with the future in mind. It'll be developed. The building itself is to be developed using the passive house model, which originates from Germany. It's basically a very tight building envelope that allows for very minimal energy requirements to heat and cool the home or the building. The site itself will seek to be net zero with an on-site solar array and air source heating pump. It'll be open to community members for green energy workshops and other community engagement. And it will also feature a greenhouse on the property to showcase the West Side's biodiversity and educate the residents of the West Side on that biodiversity and help turn them into advocates for that biodiversity. The training center itself is a very good thing because it will provide less eligibility barriers that we typically experience in some of the other training centers, and it will also work with folks who need to have more flexible schedules with the training, because people shouldn't have to be forced between gaining the training necessary to earn a living versus actually earning a living. So let's see what else. It also presents an opportunity for employment in terms of creating content and facilitating these workshops, and will also serve as the future site for Push's hiring hall. So it's important to employing community members to work where they live will drastically improve their quality of life by providing them a livable wage, reducing the time and money spent traveling to job sites outside of the community, and generally instilling a sense of pride, permanence, and ownership of their individual and collective futures. The Sustainable Workforce Training Center hopes to expand upon that goal by providing the community with a workforce training in the growing green jobs market and making said training accessible to all on the West Side.
Yeah, so that's a project that this organization is super excited about, and one that we're hoping will kind of like stand as like a visible emblem of the future like green energy possibilities that are available through state funding from more responsible policymaking like the CLCPA. Yeah, so moving on. Another, I guess, like system that we spent some time looking at for this roadmap, and to like that we like use to gain historical context around some of the difficulties that the West Side is currently experiencing, is the transportation system. And like the housing, like like housing policy in the United States and in Western New York, there were some like racist transportation policies that were implemented in the mid 20th century that have had like a drastic effect on the city that we are currently living in. So basically, so yeah, this image here is of the construction that took place around that time on the Kensington Expressway, which obviously is on the east side of the city, but is not unlike the Interstate 190 in that it has kind of like cut directly through a neighborhood, and it's much worse in the case of the Kensington Expressway than it is on the case of the west side. But yeah, I mean, this construction destroyed a neighborhood. The I-190 has separated the west side from its waterfront, and both of those highways were effectively built so that white Americans that were given insured mortgages at 0% interest rates from the federal government would be able to drive their new cars in and out of the city directly through, at high volumes, communities of color, and bring like large amounts of dirty tailpipe emissions into those neighborhoods, and kind of like excuse me, in a lot of ways it really encouraged the movement of people out of the city into suburban areas that like drastically decreased the city's tax base and had a major like environmental negative effect on various communities throughout Buffalo. So yeah, everyone's familiar with this image, like the Kensington Expressway as it like cuts through the east side where there used to be an Olmsted Parkway. And another like more like contemporary version of the inequity that exists in the transportation system that we currently have is just in the way that it provides access for people to various things, including green energy, job opportunities. So that was something that Eric talked about, and like his long commutes to places outside the city for work. And that's something that we created a graphic about to just kind of represent like how much more of a burden it is to have to take public transportation every day to get to a job that could be in your neighborhood if that was something that could and should be like much more accessible to you. Like you shouldn't have to spend an hour and a half getting to work every day to a job outside the city where you're building something that won't positively affect your community when it could be present in your neighborhood and could be positively affecting your neighborhood. So yeah, there are major accessibility inequities that exist in the city of Buffalo, and it's largely due to a really car-centric urban planning mindset that has existed in the United States, in Buffalo, New York, for a very long time now, like since the 1950s and 60s. And as we go further into all this in the summer, we hope to work with you guys to come up with ideas for like how these types of things can be remedied, and to hear your takes on your experiences with the transportation systems in the city, and come up with some ideas for how to move forward. And that transportation system has, like I mentioned, affected environmental conditions in the city. So as you can see in the image in the center here, there is a large amount of particulate matter where everything in the red is in the 95th to 100th percentile of pollution, like relative to the state as a whole. And so a lot of that stuff is coming from the Peace Bridge. It's coming from the 190. It's coming from the Kensington Expressway. These like dense car-centric transportation networks are having adverse effects on the health of our ecosystems and our communities, especially people's respiratory systems, which is especially important now that we're dealing with a respiratory pandemic that is having inequitable effects on communities of color. I mean, I think, I won't try to cite the statistics, but it's I think hopefully common knowledge now that the coronavirus pandemic is not it's not the great equalizer as it was initially posed. Like it is drastically affecting communities of color, like at a much higher rate than it is affecting white communities, largely due to things like this. And then that industry on the right, or that graphic on the right shows that although the west side has largely been a residential community for a long time and doesn't have a lot of like highly polluted industrial sites except for like those blue squares along the river, it does have those the purple dots, which represent a combined sewer overflow system, which is where during heavy rainfall our antiquated infrastructure allows for the combination of our raw sewage and our storm runoff to just like be funneled into those purple sites, which is just like dumping raw sewage and untreated storm runoff into the Niagara River, which is, and this is an example of an environmental injustice, like because these water systems are coming from all over the city and they're just being funneled into the water near the west side, which is just like drastically affecting the health of, you know, our water systems and the waters directly adjacent to the community that we're talking about. So yeah, and then another example that I think I should just mention quickly is that poorly insulated homes, although not maybe you'd think of as like an energy issue, are also a health issue. Like one, because like now we're having like a string of 90-degree days. People in poorly insulated homes are having to deal with that like in a very different way from people that have like highly insulated homes in the suburbs. Yeah, compared to like the super old homes on the west side. And the same goes for the fact that like poorly insulated homes are like leaking in a lot more of this particulate matter in the air that is highly present in this area than a well insulated home would be. So there are a lot of ways in which the west side has been kind of like victim to various systems and is being like negatively affected, and in like the form of our ecosystem and like community members' personal health. Click. There we go.
So I'm going to pose this question to the audience. What is a community asset? Has anyone ever heard that before? Does anyone have any idea what a community asset might be? Please just go ahead and include your answers in the chat. Parks? Yes. Parks are definitely a community asset. Libraries? Yes. These are more examples of what a community asset is. Ben, just go ahead and click playgrounds. Yes. Natural resource? Absolutely. So a community asset are the collective resources available to a community or its residents that can be leveraged to develop solutions that improve the wellness and social inclusion of a community and its members. So another exercise, while I mentioned the different categories of community assets, go ahead and click that, please. How many community assets can you name? Some of you have already started dropping them in the chat. Just go ahead and keep dropping them as you can think of them, especially if I happen to jog your memory or jog your imagination with the different categories.
Yeah, and especially if you can think of a specific one to the west side that you think of as
oh, yes,
special,
absolutely.
Yeah, like a special asset to our community.
Absolutely. Go ahead and click the slide again, please.
Or anywhere in Buffalo.
So there are 8 categories. LaSalle Park, yes. There are 8 categories that community assets can fall under. We have people, which includes individuals, their health, and capability of understanding. Political, which would be relationships between politicians and voters. Public foundations and public libraries, yes. Trees as well, yes, absolutely. So back to political. Relationships between politicians and their voter base, their contact information, as well as, for a direct example, Push's street team and their voter registration campaign. We have cultural, which includes food, dance, language. Social, which includes relationships between neighbors. Intellectual, which would be art programs or community labs and workshops. Financial, which would be cash or stocks, home ownership, bank accounts, credit. Built, which would include buildings, roads, playgrounds, public infrastructure. And natural, which would include clean water and air, natural flora and fauna, and community gardens. Just go ahead and just click that twice.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the different categories, and we have the West Side Bazaar, which is a perfect example of a built as well as cultural community asset, and School 77, which is itself a built community asset, but within it has Push's public offices, which serve as both social, intellectual, financial. And then we have Ujima Theater Company, which serves as cultural, intellectual, along with Piece of the City. And then it also is home to affordable housing and community solar, which themselves serve as financial and built community assets. Next slide.
Yeah, so just quickly, another important thing to take into consideration, especially when talking about energy, and another thing to that is just important to understand when talking about how to move forward with energy solutions is our local climate and weather, and the future of those systems. So obviously we exist between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario and are drastically affected, especially by Lake Erie. Buffalo is famous. I think in 2018, Buffalo got more snow than any other city with over 100,000 people in the United States. And that's because of just the massive size of Lake Erie and the way that it affects this region. Let's see if I can go back. Okay. So yeah, we're a mid-latitude, warm summer, humid continental climate. And I was going to ask everyone like if they had to guess like what the most common extreme weather event is in Western New York. It's high winds.
You can go ahead and drop that in the chat.
That wasn't supposed to be on the page yet. But a lot of people might say like blizzards or something along those lines because that's what we're famous for. But it's important to know that Buffalo, because of Lake Erie, is like an extremely windy area. And we get a lot of thunderstorms and high winds that are going to have a direct effect on any infrastructure that we build. And so it's important to keep those things in mind, whether it be like utilizing, like harnessing that renewable power that comes from the lake, or whether it be just understanding that, you know, tree limbs are going to fall and they're going to rip off the siding of homes and they're going to destroy power lines. That's just something that is kind of like inseparable from our energy systems. And then another thing that is obviously important to look at is the future of Western New York in the context of climate change. This region, temperatures are rising like they are in everywhere else on the planet. And by some studies, like at an even faster rate. We're definitely getting more precipitation in this region than a lot of other places are due to climate change. And that's, you know, in large part, again, because of the presence of Lake Erie and the fact that like these hotter temperatures are just going to keep increasing evaporation and, you know, the water cycle, et cetera, is going to drop just more and more water on us, which is going, again, to have a direct effect on our infrastructure and those combined sewer overflow systems that come with our antiquated water infrastructure. But yeah, so we're going to have rising temperatures, increasing amounts of precipitation, surprisingly enough, colder winters as well, by some accounts, because of the way that a warming Arctic region is going to affect where the polar jet streams exist. And because of like the differential between temperatures like way far north and further south, that jet stream may like go further south and like bring Arctic air closer to us in the wintertime, which would give us colder winters. So basically, Western New York is looking at extremes on both ends of the spectrum as we move forward into the future. And another extreme that is very possible is like a massive influx of climate migrants and immigrants due to the fact that we are present to a large amount of fresh water. And like all of these things are just, you know, need to be centered in any conversation around planning in the city of Buffalo in the future, because one, we need to be aware of the climate itself and the weather that comes with it. And two, we need to be able to plan for this possibility of a massive influx of people, and to make sure that we can accommodate both them and the people that already live in the city of Buffalo. And hopefully we'll be able to like see a city government that takes all of that into account, and press the city government to take all of those things into account, and live in a city of Buffalo that isn't going to have some massive wave of like climate gentrification, people from New York City that are escaping flooding down there, so on and so forth. There's just like a lot that needs to go into the future planning around these things. Yeah, so next slide.
All right, so in the interest of time, I'm just going to kind of touch as briefly on these things as possible. What we have here is a infographic showing the level of consumption for all of New York State versus the level of production. As you can see, there's a gross disparity. It's about 25% of the total energy we consume we actually produce in New York State. Good news is that this is mostly due to our gas infrastructure. A lot of our methane gas is fracked from Pennsylvania and imported up here. Bad news is it does not mean that even though we mostly produce our electricity here that we use, there is the fact that about 33% of the source material used to generate that electricity is methane gas, which again comes from Pennsylvania. Go ahead and click that slide, please. So as you can see, our total energy consumption by sector in Buffalo is outlined here. A large majority of that goes to residential as opposed to all of New York State, where we'll see that the larger portion of energy is consumed by the commercial sector. Click again. We have here a line graph that shows that total renewable energy production is on the rise. However, we do see still a rise as well in fossil fuel production. So our current dependence on fossil fuel is still very predominant. Now, this is an example of our electrical infrastructure. As you can see, we have the components, the owners, and the price regulators. And on the component side, we have generation, which includes nuclear power, renewable resources in terms of turbines, hydroelectricity, as well as production factories where, for example, like coal or methane gas is burned to generate electricity. Then we have the large transmission lines, which get it to the distribution lines, which are owned by National Grid. And then from those transmission lines, it comes to our homes. When it comes to these owners, a lot of these owners are hedge fund companies, which, like I mentioned before, are really only interested in increasing their profits via investments on infrastructure that is predominantly focused on using fossil fuels. When it comes to price regulators, you have on the wholesale market side, which includes generation and transmission, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, as well as NISO. Those are both appointed by the president. And then on the retail side, which includes distribution and use, you have the Public Service Commission, as well as the Long Island Power Authority, both of which have members appointed by the governor. And click one more last time. And so this last graphic that's going to pop up shows our incredible dependence on gas. When it comes to the Climate Leadership and Protection Act, the CLCPA, it has bold timelines on reduction of emissions, and as well as a dismantling of the gas infrastructure, because just in general, it's not a clean source of energy. They peddle that a false solution is being cleaner than coal, but the fact of the matter is we're still extracting it via methods like hydraulic fracturing, which render ecological communities and our own communities open to fatal consequences. And then we go ahead and go to the next slide.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, so when it comes to planning our own energy future, we have the CLCPA, which was initially coined as the CCPA in the center. Like I said, it focuses on emissions reductions to 100% emissions reductions by 2050, with 85% of those emissions reductions coming from just transitioning to new, cleaner energies, and 15% of that reduction with carbon emissions offsets. We also have that is also going to provide us a framework for further investment in green jobs, as well as penalties for polluting companies that will be funneled back into frontline communities such as the West Side. and some ways that we can use some of that funding and maybe even figure out other ways to gain funding and knowledge is through community solar, like this picture here. This is of the Blue Rock Solar, excuse me, that's found is a solar farm that was created in Grand Island. Is actually, you'll see it if you're making your way towards Niagara Falls. Just prior to the Niagara Falls bridge, actually, it's a rather large plot of land that just has dozens of solar arrays, and that was, the community like Grand Island can create and see the value in and savings in transitioning to non-renewable resources. Then why can't we? Next up, we have geothermal heating and cooling, which essentially uses ground source heating via a pump. It uses water and antifreeze to warm our homes. Basically, the water transitions into the ground where it's raised to about 55 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's pulled back up, and a heating pump raises the degree temperature during colder times to a more suitable temperature and transitions that heat. It extracts that heat energy out and just basically continues to cycle the water over and over, keeping the house warm throughout the winter, and does the opposite during the summer to keep the house cool. One such example of a property in the west side that uses geothermal heating would be 10 Winter Street, which is considered a net zero house. It's considered net zero because it gets all of its energy needs met on site via solar panels and a geothermal pump installed in the side lot. And this serves as an example of how we can construct housing with renewable energy in mind and to be extremely more efficient than we have now. And finally, through the efforts of Heat Massachusetts, it's a grassroots organization based in Massachusetts. Following the Merrimack Valley gas explosion of 2018, they were able to pressure the gas companies to focus on investing money out instead of in aging gas pipeline infrastructure that would be obsolete by about 2040 into something called geo micro districts, where they're basically going to be repurposing the old gas lines to transition away from gas and instead to have a geothermal heating and cooling system that serves an entire community rather than just a single home.
Yeah, and then I guess. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry. So I was going to say that as it serves the Eco Justice Team and other community organizations in the West Side, you can use this roadmap and the information therein to be opponents of change and to actually become the first line of people that try to develop renewable energy solutions. By deciding, by putting forth where we might be able to develop community solar, or how we can pressure lawmakers and officials and in some of these utility companies into transitioning into more renewable energies, to like passing smart legislation, responsible legislation. And some of these include like increasing awareness and advocacy for home energy audits and weatherization, planning community solar, figuring out how we could potentially use the example set by Heat to create geo micro districts in Buffalo, as well as putting out more information about models such as the passive home model that would decrease the energy demand of a home and that would maximize the efficiency of maximize the efficiency of renewable energy sources.
And yeah, just to tack on, like we just kind of all went over like all of these historic systems and like just these overviews of the systems that affect the West Side. Like a lot of the work that we've done in the last 6 months has been to kind of like baseline the area and get like a really solid, just like basic understanding of the West Side's history and its needs. And like Eric said, the next major step is to kind of like do this planning. And I think that the Eco Justice Team is like poised super well as a community group that is like focused on environmental justice and like a sustainable, equitable future, to be the people that are like out advocating for environmental justice solutions, and like coming to conclusions for themselves about like what they want to see in their community and how they want to see CLCPA funding spent. So again, yeah, just like thank you guys for like being here, listening to all of this, and like we like can't wait to like do more of this with you in the future and like come to these conclusions like as a group of like interested community members that like want to make the change here on the west side. So yeah.
As far as what comes next, for us, Ben and I will be conducting and constructing a series of workshops around the roadmap where we're going to dive in depth into a lot of the different sections that we mentioned today. There's going to be a lot more information. So please feel free to contact us. Our contact information is going to be in the following slide for registration, as well as any other questions you might have, or suggestions rather. We also can strategize ways to pressure our elected officials to support the CLCPA more readily, as well as to pass the Climate, Community, and Investment Act, which is a partner legislation that really delves into where specifically a lot of this funding is going to come from and how it's going to be received. And lastly, if you were interested, if you or anyone you know would be interested in a home energy audit to see if weatherization or retrofit will save them money on their energy bills, you can contact Push Green. We've got Kelly Camacho about joining the Eco Justice team at kelly@pushbuffalo.org. You can contact Angel, who's also on the call with us today, for more information about Push's housing justice campaigns at housingjustice@pushbuffalo.org. And for the Push Green energy audits and weatherization, you can contact Lou De Jesus to learn about how you can lower your energy bills at pushbuffalo.com or .org, excuse me.
Yeah. So now we just have a quick 30-minute short film to show you guys. Just kidding. We actually went way over time. Thank you for listening to us for this long. We really appreciate everyone being here, and any questions, anything, yeah, shoot.
Okay, do you want to turn off your screen sharing so this way I can see everybody in case we have questions? If you have a question, just, I don't know, either motion or do one of the reactions so we know who has questions. Taylor did drop a question in the chat about elected officials if you guys want to check that out.
That's a very good question. I think when it comes down to which elected officials you can pressure for like the CLCPA and for CCIA championship, see some of the people that we tried to pressure prior to this CLCPA being passed were Representative Crystal Peoples-Stokes. That's the only name that I can remember, unfortunately.
To be honest, I think that coming up with strategies around those kinds of things is something that's going to be just like really important to do as a group moving forward. And I just like at these Eco Justice team meetings or in the workshops that Eric and I are going to be doing, I would love to like have more involved conversations about things like that specifically. Which is a long way of saying I also don't have any names off the top of my head, but I would love to like do that kind of work like with you and anyone else that wants to like participate in that kind of stuff.
And speaking of Crystal Peoples-Stokes, we are having a Western New York town hall on Black Lives Matter, COVID, climate change, and the intersectionality of all of those. That is going to be on Friday, the 17th, July 17th. It's going to be on Zoom from 2 to 3 p.m. We're having Senator Tim Kennedy on, as well as Crystal Peoples-Stokes. And I hope to see you guys there, and that might be a good chance to ask some of the questions that you have, Taylor.
What time did you say that was, Kelly?
It is from 2 to 3:30. We actually just finished up that flyer today, and so that should be starting to get out pretty soon.
Awesome.
All right. If there are no other questions, I guess we will be finishing on time. Oh, David, I think you have a question. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, I'll ask. So this was really comprehensive, so thank you. And it covers a ton of stuff. And it fits in the model, that and the regenerative model, of course. So just want to baseline, thank you guys for doing all that. So two things. One is, eventually, have you considered the potential backlash that you might get from National Grid, National Fuel for, taking away their monopoly per se? Like, we're too small right now for them to really worry about maybe, but eventually if this is a scalable model, they're not going to go down without a fight would be my guess. So is that part of maybe phase 2 or 3 of what you're thinking about, or is that not worried about it?
Well, that's definitely something that needs to be focused on throughout this whole process, because of the CLCPA and the new guidelines about carbon emissions for the state, this transition to renewable energies is going to happen, whether it be controlled by community members and small organizations that want to localize control and power and production and distribution of energy, or massive companies like National Grid and National Fuel. And so
it's important to note that these companies they do have an eye towards the future in that regard, and a lot of their rhetoric that opposes a transition is really geared towards stalling the transition until they have figured out a way to place themselves in the position of power and control. And so when it comes down to whether or not they're going to go down without a fight, they currently aren't going down without a fight, and it is going to be a fight. And very specifically, and this is something we'll discuss more in one of our workshop sessions, it's going to be very important for community members and coalitions to become a part of what are called rate cases. These are where a lot of decisions are made in regards to rate increases for our utilities, as well as whether or not they're going to invest in infrastructure that's obviously going to be passed down to ratepayers in terms of paying it back with interest. So as we transition into what is the phrase is, transition is inevitable, justice is not. As Ben said, it's inevitable that we transition as a nation into and states into renewable energy systems. The biggest question is just how are we going to be able to force these people to give the reign of control to us. There's some legal precedent for it. It's just a matter of developing the people power necessary and getting some more policies such as the CLCPA passed that gives that power to us and gives us an actual framework.
Yeah, and even towards the beginning of this project, when we were trying to collect data about energy usage on the west side of Buffalo, obviously National Grid and National Fuel were some of the first people that we went to looking for that, and just stonewall, of course. I mean, that's kind of what led to going out into the streets and interacting with individuals and households and talking about energy with people, trying to data in that way. So yeah, I mean, it's not easy to go up against a monopoly, but I think there are ways in which it can be done effectively. So yeah.
And if there are no further questions, I would just really like to thank Ben and Eric for being here today. The presentation was absolutely wonderful. I think it was very digestible, and it was really great to hear. We will be putting this presentation up on social media, so you guys will be able to review it. And I just want to thank everybody and give you an extra thanks. I know we're 4 minutes over. I just want to respect everybody's time and make sure that you guys know we're really grateful for those extra 4 minutes. So thanks, everybody.
Briefly, before we close out, also in the interest of saving people's time, Taylor had asked a question about keeping updated in the workshops. There was an email address that was at the end of the slides, but that email is cmtenergy@pushbuffalo.org. Again, that's cmtenergy@pushbuffalo.org, and that's how you can get in contact with either Ben or myself.
And we'll be sending out information with more detail in the future too. So
yeah, as always, I will send out a follow-up email with access to Ben and Eric in it. So if you guys have any additional questions, you guys can always reach right out to them.
Thank you.
Sweet. Thank you, everyone.
And now I will close out the meeting if that's okay.
It's totally fine. Good night.
Bye, guys. you.